As you are aware, the Economic Union came into existence in 1975, and France took a counter move. France tried to divide ECOWAS. So France formed an alternative economic bloc that gathered the former colonies, the French-speaking countries. So, in addition to ECOWAS, we also had a French version of ECOWAS, and that was an attempt by France to divide the West African sub-region. And France knew that ECOWAS was initiated by Nigeria, and France has always taken steps to weaken Nigeria because France didn't want a powerful African country emerging in Africa that will challenge French hegemony on the continent. So even during the civil war in Nigeria, France supported France supported the forces that were involved in the civil war because France was interested in a weakened Nigeria that would not be able to challenge France. It's interesting that France is now counting the support. France is counting on the support from ECOWAS, and it's very hypocritical because France, throughout history, has done so many things to weaken ECOWAS so that ECOWAS will not be able to bring economic integration between the French-speaking countries and the English-speaking countries in Africa. When we look at the ECOWAS strategy on Niger, we have to understand that the African leaders have their own interests, and I will focus only on Nigeria. Nigeria's President Bola Tinubu, he has some issues at home. First of all, he has been accused of electoral fraud, and the election that brought him to power is being contested in court, and there's a possibility that a court could disqualify him. Even if that doesn't happen, there's also an issue. The issue is related to an alleged crime that Tinubu committed when he was in the United States. It's all over the news, and the issue is related to a forfeiture. Tinubu allegedly forfeited an amount of 460,000 US dollars. That amount is in connection with drug proceeds, and Tinubu forfeited 460,000 US dollars. In other words, the president of Nigeria is implicated in a drug scandal that occurred in the United States, and his opponents have been able to get access to the court documents where Tinubu, the president of Nigeria, was allegedly involved in a drug transaction that happened in the United States, and as a result, he was ordered by a court in the United States to forfeit 460,000 United States dollars. And the question is whether that is a judgment, a civil or criminal judgment, and that will surpass as a crime that would disqualify Tinubu from to be a president of the United States. His opponents are also alleging that the elections that brought Tinubu to power was fraudulent. They are challenging that in court. And some people believe that Tinubu, as the president of Nigeria and also as the chairperson of ECOWAS, is trying to use the Niger crisis to distract attention from his problems. And so if he takes Nigeria to war in Niger, and then he will be able to probably prolong his stay, because constitutionally he could argue that Nigeria is at war, and so he should stay in power. A lot of people are speculating ulterior motives, particularly when we talk about the president of Nigeria, who is bent on leading ECOWAS to go to Niger to quote unquote restore peace and order in Niger. It's very hypocritical that some of the African nations that are supporting ECOWAS intervention in Niger also in power, and they are in power through fraudulent means. If you take Togo as an example, Togo is like a family affair. The first president of Togo, he ruled for a long time, and later on his son came to rule. And so it's like a family affair, as we see in other parts of the world, where families that are very powerful are able to stay in power through fair and foul means. If you look at Ivory Coast, take the case of Alassane Ouattara. He was crying over when his predecessor didn't want to leave, and it was France that led a military detachment to Ivory Coast to dislodge the Ivorian president who didn't want to leave power. And Alassane Ouattara was installed as the new president of the Ivory Coast. And you know what he did? He instigated a constitutional change that allowed him to go for a third term. The Ivorian constitution called for 2 terms, but Ouattara engineered his way out so that he will stay for another term, and that is constitutional engineering. And so you see some African nations that have presidents who have engineered their way to stay in power for a long time. And so the African people see hypocrisy, and they see why the Western powers, particularly France, uh, do not object to such incumbency, did not reject to the attempt by some African leaders to prolong their stay in power. But now, all of a sudden, they are talking about the military intervention in the military coup in Niger, and they are now talking about an intervention to restore peace and order in Niger, where at the same time they close their eyes to what happened in Ivory Coast, and they also close their eyes to the elections in Nigeria that many people consider to be a fraudulent election. And going back to Niger again, it's very unfortunate. Niger is a case of an African nation sitting on strategic materials. We're talking about uranium, talking about gold, talking about oil, but the people in Niger are very poor. They export uranium. I would say they don't export uranium. It's France that is exporting the uranium. Why? Because it's France that is exporting the uranium in Niger. When we talk about raw materials, particularly strategic raw materials, it's very unfortunate that the African nations that have these strategic materials have led the materials to be exploited by foreign powers. If you're talking about gold in Ghana, the Ghana government gets 10%, only 10%. And I'm not sure what percentage of uranium goes to Niger. But as Niger is exporting uranium to France, Niger is also exporting human beings to other African nations. Nigerian children and women, they are all over the West African sub-region. What do? They are beggars on the streets. If you go to Ghana, if you go to Ivory Coast, if you go to Nigeria and other places, you see small boys and girls walking on the streets. They don't have anything to do, and all that they do is they beg for money. And when they get the money, they give the money to their parents, and they beg all day from morning to the evening, even to the night, and they don't go to school. And when we're talking about going to school, we're talking about education. And so don't forget that the Gentile powers, the European powers, they had an interest in suppressing the education of the African. There are two ways that they can accomplish this objective. The first one is to miseducate the African, and what we call miseducation of the Negro in the United States. And for those of you who are Hebrews, who are Africans or people of African descent, you know the concept of miseducation, and a book was written, The Miseducation of the Negro. You miseducate the Negro, you miseducate the African, because you have an interest to exploit him, to cheat him. You don't want him to have proper education. And so you can keep people down so you can control them, and that will be through miseducation. And so the education that was introduced by the European powers, they were Eurocentric education, and it did not afford the African the opportunity to look at Africa in the context of Africa, look at conditions from an Afrocentric perspective. So the analysis that they got through their miseducation was an Eurocentric perspective. And it's unfortunate because the leaders, the African leaders who took over from the colonial masters, a lot of them had this miseducation, and so they were not able to bring development to their people. They still relied on the colonial masters for policies and for advice. And this scenario was more pronounced in the Francophone countries. And now the young men, including the 35-year-old leader of Burkina Faso and the leader of Niger, they have seen the situation that they are in, and they have seen that their leaders are puppets of France. And so now they are rebelling against the old system. When we're talking about education, it's not only miseducation. The European powers, the Gentile powers, they also pursued a policy of non-education. So two things. If you want to if you want to colonize somebody, if you want to have power over him, it's psychological. You educate him, but you give him a wrong education. You give him what you call miseducation. And the second strategy will be to not educate him at all. And this second strategy is even worse, non-education. The case of Congo is very, very significant here. Congo is a nation that has a lot of natural resources. In a book called Africa Must Unite, or Sadiford Dr. Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, said that the hydroelectric potential on the river Congo alone is such that it will have the ability to give electrical power to a large number of the African nations. That is why he recommended that Africa must unite and form a continental economy and use African resources. The Europeans were aware that the Africans have resources. The Europeans are aware that when Africa is controlled by African leaders who are wise, who are visionaries, who are not puppets, their control over the continent will be undermined. And so the European powers decided not to educate the Africans. And I'll give you the example from Congo. Congo, at the time of independence, how many Congolese had a bachelor's degree? The answer is 12. There were only 12 people, 12 Congolese who had education up to the first degree, a bachelor's degree. At the time of independence, the whole country, Congo, a large country with mineral resources, they had 12 graduates, people who had a degree, a bachelor's degree. It was in the interest of the colonial powers not only to miseducate the African, but to keep them from reading, keep them from acquiring the skills that they will use to develop their nation, so that African nations will continue to depend on them. And so I'll tell you a story that happened. The story is that some people came from Namibia. Namibia at that time was under colonial rule, and they came to Ghana, and they were invited to tour some industries in Ghana, and they saw Ghanaians working on machines, working in factories. These were industries established by Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana. And when the Namibian people they saw that it was possible for a black man to work in industries and to operate complicated machines, they started weeping. They wept because in their country, in Namibia, they were still under colonial rule. They were not independent. They were miseducated. They were not educated. So they did not have the skills to operate the machines. Even if they were given independence, they would not have the skills to operate machines to to develop their economic resources, because the Europeans had kept them uneducated. And that is the basis of the book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. It's a book that I will recommend for you to read, a book written by Walter Rodney. And so the case of miseducation, the case of non-education is still going on in Africa, in Niger, a nation that produces uranium that is used for nuclear weapons, a nation producing uranium that is the basis for electrical power in France, but 80% of the country in Niger, they are living in darkness. They export uranium and strategic materials to Europe, but they have to export young children and women to other African nations to beg for food on the streets from morning to evening, even till night, and they don't go to school. So these are children from Niger. They do not go to school because they are beggars. They are begging on the streets in Africa. And it's unfortunate because at the time of making video, foreign powers are trooping in, and they are using African leaders who are puppets. They are using Nigeria, they are using Ivory Coast, they are using ECOWAS, and they are using all the people that they can trust to destabilize Niger with an intent to cause what we call structural violence. According to Johan Gatun, one way of destroying the people is to cause structural violence, and so the people will kill themselves when there's structural violence. And a war in Niger will cause structural violence. It will also lead to Africa being used as the new theater for the war between Russia and NATO. And as you are aware, if there's war in Niger, it will not be fought by Nigerians alone. It will be an African war. It will be an European war. It will be a world war, and Africa will be the theater. The elephants will fight, but the grass will suffer, and Niger will suffer, and France again, France that was involved in the exploitation and enslavement of Haiti, France again involved in the exploitation and neo-colonizing of Niger, France again, France again. Watch this video. I'm leaving the comment in the description box, and subscribe to the channel and spread the word and spread the awakening. We are in a time where the African, wherever you are, you need to be awakened to the time that we're in, the time that the Gentile powers are doing all things possible to depopulate the African continent. And what best way to depopulate the African continent when you can bring a war that will engulf the Sahel and bring the world powers to fight on the African continent? Awake, Africa, awake, the Hebrews who are scattered over the world, and see what is going on in the land of the Negro in West Africa, the land that the Europeans considered as the slave coast. Thank you for watching this video.